Welcome to Adapting Your DRK Research Amid the COVID-19 Pandemic, hosted by Cadre. We are happy to have Drs. Eisman, Oxendorf, O'Dwyer, and Stockdale with us to launch our discussion. Beth Eisman is currently a program director at the National Science Foundation and a professor in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. Rob Oxendorf is an NSF program director and the DRK 12 program lead. Laura O'Dwyer is a professor in the Department of Measurement, Evaluation, Statistics, and Assessment at Lynch School of Education, Boston College. And Alan Stockdale is the Human Protections Program Director at EDC. This webinar will include two parts. During the first part, our panelists will each share their thoughts on the implications of the pandemic on research. All participants will be muted during this portion of the webinar. The second part will be devoted to Q&A. We'd like for this webinar to be as interactive as possible, given the number of attendees present. So I encourage you to share your experience, expertise, and ideas through general comments and conversation in the chat box throughout the session. During Q&A, we'll allow participants to ask a question or make a comment by either raising their hand or typing questions in the Q&A window with an option to do so anonymously. We will review the logistics before beginning Q&A. In the meantime, we do ask that you consider ways of framing your questions so the response may be helpful to many of us, rather than asking a question unique or specific to your project. Those questions are better saved for a conversation with your program officer at another time. If you have technical difficulties at any time throughout the webinar, please let us know in the chat window accessible at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also email us at cadre@edc.org. Finally, we're recording this webinar and we'll provide all registered participants with access to the recording. And we encourage you to watch for Cadre emails or check NSF's website for any updates or addition to resources and guidance that they are providing. So let's get started. Alan, will you share some of your thoughts about the implications of COVID-19 research, especially those related to human subjects issues? I think you're muted. We just need to unmute you, Ken.
Sorry about that. One of the things we've been dealing with over the last couple of months is people, converting or trying to convert or trying to see if they can convert in-person research, stuff that was happening in classrooms, into online research. So that's most of what we've been dealing with the last couple of months. For some projects, this has been very difficult, and for some, it's a sort of work in progress. So, one of the things that we're sort of seeing, which is we're trying to figure out at the moment, but is a little bit problematic because it's something that we weren't doing before, is people wanting to do focus groups or interviews with students from their homes where they're now doing their schooling, or some of them are. So, obviously recording interviews and doing research with a child in a home environment is completely different from a school environment. So that's one of the things we're trying to figure out, how to do that sort of appropriately and securely. And there are other issues that go with that. How do you do informed consent issues? So we started looking at things like electronic informed consent and how to do that. Some projects are sharing tablets and other things with students that they're working with. So how do you send items through the mail and make sure that that is safe? So there's, those are sort of issues that have been coming up. And then, one of the things that came up in some of the questions people were asking, which we've also been thinking about, is equity issues. Clearly some kids are doing schooling at home and have access to, internet connections and electronic devices that allow them to do that. But, there are lots of populations for whom that maybe isn't realistic, or limited access to the technology that allows that to happen. So clearly equity issues. One of the things we're thinking about a little bit going forward is issues to do with, what happens when things start to open up again. And that looks like it might be quite complex. I mean, I could imagine different school districts opening up at different times, different regions of the country opening up at different times. People opening up and then closing down again as more COVID cases arise. I don't know whether schools are going to want to do research. There may be some types of research that are maybe more appropriate, when a school opens back up again than others. I'm thinking like, there's a huge difference between a classroom, researchers standing at the back of a classroom doing observations, and we have research projects that involve VR headsets. Obviously, potential, that's involves somebody putting something on their handling devices and putting them on their face. That's obviously a much higher risk than researchers standing at the back of the classroom. So those are the sort of issues that we're thinking about.
Great, thank you. Laura, as a methodologist, what are some of the challenges and opportunities with current and future research design and implementation that you're thinking about?
Thank you, Catherine. Sorry. We're all dealing with various challenges in our research right now. So I'm pleased to be able to join the group here to talk through some of these. From what I've learned in speaking with colleagues and in looking at the questions posed ahead of time, is that the impact of the challenges we're facing seems to vary according to the phase of the study that we're in. So some of us are lucky that our data collection and implementation phases are complete. My own DRK 12 falls into that, thank goodness. While others are early in their studies and their implementation and data collection activities haven't been affected yet. And then there are those who were in the midst of these, they were in the midst of that both this spring, so those have been affected. So in response to your question, I'm not sure that I have necessarily exact solutions to each of the types of questions that have been posed by the attendees, but what I hope I can provide is with some guidance about the issues that people should consider when they're dealing with these disrupted implementation and data collection phases, both this past spring and maybe in the coming year. And it seems to be that there are sort of two big types of issues. There are the known access issues that people faced this spring with either their implementation and or data collection transitioning online, or sometimes being halted completely, right? For some, this means that the fidelity of the implementation was compromised, or that post-intervention data couldn't be collected, or could be collected under sort of modified circumstances. And then we have these unknown access issues that we have no idea what's coming in the fall, whether perhaps school children will be staggered attending in classrooms, whether they will stay online for many schools. As Alan mentioned, that you will have states and even districts, counties opening up at different rates and making different decisions. So that may well affect the validity of the research findings from site to site. So I sort of have come up with this overarching question that you should consider when you're thinking about how to deal with these challenges. And it's sort of like research 101, in that the big question is, so do the disruptions that had occurred this spring or are likely to occur over the coming school year affect the internal and external validity of the study? So for example, if you were unable to complete your implementation, you may be able to address only parts of your research questions or some of your research questions. This is something that I expect Beth will touch on in her comments. Some of you may have had to transition your implementation online, and you will have to consider whether the substance of the intervention was maintained in that transition in a way that will allow you to address the research questions. Likewise with fidelity, can you be sure that whatever fidelity measures or safeguards you have in place can be maintained across classrooms, teachers, research sites. So basically the big question here is, was my intervention implemented in a way that allows me to address my research questions as they were posed? I know that several of you have had to transition to online data collection. Now, Alan mentioned some of the logistics there with collecting data online, an online presence in a virtual classroom. But the way that I would think about this, because the logistics are going to vary, is you need to think about whether you are still measuring the same constructs in an online environment. Right? Not only are you measuring the ones that you intended to measure, but are there other constructs that you should be measuring? If we use, for example, something like classroom engagement, one might ask whether engagement in an online environment manifests differently than it does in a face-to-face environment. So you might have to think about new or modified instruments that would need to be adopted for future phases. So the question from here is, are the constructs still relevant in the new situation? And am I still using the most appropriate data collection instruments? Some of you also had questions about whether you could impute post-intervention data. That's an empirical question as to whether it's possible. I mean, it is definitely plausible to do it. The question is, how well can you do it? And can you do it in a way that allows you to address your research question? One idea would be to, use your existing data and impute existing post-test scores and see how well your pre-test imputes your post-test scores. The other piece then, of course, is the generalizability, which Alan also touched on, about are we seeing equity in who we're able to reach? Does that affect our ability to generalize beyond the sample in our study? Are we hearing all voices in whatever manifestation your study will take? But overall, the big question is to look closely at what is being affected here, what parts of my internal validity have been compromised, as well as my external validity, and then look within those, be systematic about it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Beth, you're a longtime DRK 12 awardee and current program officer at NSF. What issues and opportunities are you hearing about?
So I guess I'll put my response in the context of I have an ongoing long-term partnership with a group of teachers who have been doing action research on their classroom discourse for the last 7 years or so. So it's a little different setting than what I was hearing Laura referring to, because the teachers themselves are collecting a lot of the data instead of myself at this point. But I would say first and foremost, the biggest issue has just been the emotional toll that the shift has taken, both for the teachers and then the teachers taking care of the students that they work with. It's creating a lot of extra workload on their end, which has been a huge issue. The teachers feel like all of the work they had done to facilitate classroom discourse and develop relationships with their kids has been disrupted, and they're actually having to revert back to all kinds of practices that they engaged in way at the beginning of the project. So they feel like it's actually taking a lot of things backwards. They don't have the types of platforms and things available in terms of the technology to continue facilitating the kinds of discussions they had kids facilitating in. They're worried about issues of access and equity and increased trauma in the classrooms with the youth that they work with. So there's a lot of different sort of human aspects of this that I think is foregrounded in our conversations that we have. So I would say the shifts have been more in taking time to pause, and we do have data, as Laura was alluding to, depending on where you're at in your project, spending some time looking at data, thinking about what kinds of surveys might support the action research that they're doing, trying to find resources that they can use with their kids, and supporting the graduate students to start doing analysis and looking at some of the data and doing some disseminating. So it's sort of putting the research aspect on pause for right now, and concentrating more on supporting each other and figuring out how we might move forward together as a group. I think those are the main things. So it's a shift in attention, not so much a shift in focus, but trying to figure out how to do the best work the teachers can do with the students. And I'm sure, as Rob will say, that this was a DRK-12 grant at one point in time, but after revisiting the NSF site, like the scope of the work that's proposed within the grant proposal is really what the commitment is for any project that's been funded. And if any changes happen with that, then it's conversations with your program officers. And I'll let Rob talk from more of a DRK-12 perspective so that we don't have too much duplication.
Thanks, Beth. So Rob is the lead of the DRK-12 program. So great to continue on this line. What advice do you have? Guidance.
Thank you, Catherine. So, NSF remains committed at an agency level to providing the utmost flexibility to PIs to deliver on their research objectives. Obviously, one of the easiest ways for programs like DRK-12 and program officers to be supportive is with changes in dates and extending projects. Clearly, that is one easy thing that we can do, and we've been instructed to be very flexible in terms of PIs requesting changes in dates, and that's fine. I also encourage folks to consult our FAQs for awardees on the NSF website. As soon as you hit nsf.gov, there's a link to COVID-related resources. And education certainly impacted, but pretty much all fields of basic science research impacted. And so know that you as a research community are not alone. We're all sort of navigating these uncertain times, and I have found some of these resources to be quite helpful in thinking about the FAQs. Significant changes to scope. Certainly, you would have to run those changes past your program officer. Generally speaking, awards were made to do certain kinds of research, and as much as possible, the NSF would like to see that research carried out. To the extent that new questions arise, new opportunities exist around COVID, we have other mechanisms to support those opportunities, for example, the RAPID mechanism, as well as upcoming application deadlines for various programs such as ECR and DRK-12. So anyway, I'll close with that, but certainly we want to be very flexible and supportive in helping PIs complete their work. And so we ask that your program officer be the first point of contact with questions that you have.
Thanks, Rob, and all for those thoughts. So that launches us into more of a conversation, hopefully. We now want to invite questions and comments.
Can't hear you, Catherine.
Can you hear me now?
You're quite soft.
That's strange. Can you hear me any better now if I yell?
A little bit.
It's a little better.
I don't know what's, I'm not sure what happened to my computer. So I'll try and yell.
That's better.
Okay. So thank you for those thoughts. And now we want to move into the more conversational part of the webinar. So we invite questions and comments from participants. And as a reminder, there are 3 ways to join the conversation. On this slide, you can see the controls that you'll need to participate. You can find the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you want to direct a question or a comment to a panelist, please raise your hand. We will call on you in order. When you are called upon, we'll invite you to unmute yourself. And at that time, you can ask your question. You can also type your question into the Q&A box. Kadri will gather those questions and pose them to the panelists. And you can type your comments into the chat box. Please use this space to offer your own responses to participant questions for general communication and to interact with other participants. So, Jen, do we have any raised hands?
Not at this time.
Okay, great. Then I will ask one of the questions that was posed earlier, and hopefully you can hear me well enough. Are you hearing me any better now? Okay. Maybe I don't need to yell. So one of the first questions that was posed is anyone developing a protocol for researchers entering schools to conduct research, such as a code of conduct? For instance, I will wash my hand at the entry to school, I'll wear a mask, I will cancel my visit if I have X symptoms, etc. Does anybody know about, any one of you know about any of these protocols or guidance? No.
It seems like a great idea, however.
We haven't seen anything like being proposed yet. I mean, everybody's like asking, how do we move things online? So I'm sure we're going to be seeing that at some time in the future, maybe over the summer.
Okay, there's something for somebody to do. Here's another question for you, Alan. What are guidelines or best practices related to online consent and or assent forms?
Oh boy. Well, one of the things, a lot of the research we do is either, exempt. So, we don't, because of low risk, we don't necessarily have a lot of oversight over consent forms. We kind of advise on them. And then the expedited ones, obviously, go through the approval process. With the moving into, I mean, one of the things we've been concerned about with like being, in classroom activities into activities where you're interacting with students in a home environment is like, if you're making recordings or shooting videos, then there needs to be a lot of parent involvement on that. I mean, if you're doing that sort of things in a school, you're, obviously there's a lot of control over those activities by the school and the teachers and the administrators and what have you. One of the things that we've been, I mean, even before this, we would say like, if you're doing any type of recording activity of minors, you have to get signed parental consent. It doesn't matter if you're in an exempt study or not, you have to do that because there are all sorts, I mean, apart from the human subjects regulations, there are all sorts of WAP and laws, that vary from state to state. And so, I mean, that's become much more of an issue with, Zoom, collection of data through Zoom and other types of applications where you're interacting with people in a home environment. And not just the consent, but really there needs to be a lot of parental involvement in setting up those kind of data collection activities so that, the parent is involved and that those kind of recordings are appropriate. I mean, in a home environment, you just don't know what you're going to end up recording. So that's like a concern. The actual consent, we've been sort of trying to figure out how to do that. We're trying to avoid things like mailing things because that involves contact and there's a certain level of risk of transferring the virus through contact and objects. So we've been trying to figure out consent or allowing consent through recording an adult. There might be a waiver of documented consent, and then you just, when the adult came on, you just record the consent. So you go over the consent form and it would be part of the initial part of the consortium. So we have had a project this week that was wanting to do that with the parents so that you would record consent for for the research and for the recording right at the beginning of the recording with the parent and the child together. So that's, I mean, but this has been a sort of working project. We've been looking at electronic consent using things like DocuSign or Adobe. There's lots of things, but you know, there are problems with those and there are difficulties with those depending on the sort of technology that the subject has is using. So we're still sort of working on that.
Thank you. I'll continue. If another panelist at any time has a response to add, just let me know, raise your hand or something. I'm going to ask one more question. I see we have a raised hand, but before we call on that person, we have a question that's maybe for you, Rob. What do you recommend for writing new proposals? Given the uncertainty of our intended research contexts, should we preemptively include a COVID contingency plan for different potential research scenarios? Would this count in the page limits?
Yeah, this is a great question. We are navigating these waters with the rest of you. A COVID contingency plan is not one of the NSF merit review criteria, but I would suspect that accounting for some of these issues in your research plan might be viewed favorably by your peers who will review your proposal. I guess one other thought here, you know, to the extent that your research depends on schools being open, that's one thing. To the extent that your research could be focused more on synchronous and asynchronous kinds of learning activities around STEM, that's a whole other issue, right? So just depends on the nature of your research. DRK 12, like pretty much all programs in the foundation, are very much field initiated. So, you know, we respond to the field. And so if there are pressing questions in the field about how to deliver high quality STEM instruction in this current climate, then we may likely see that in the cohort of proposals that come in the fall. And that could be a potential direction to take research. I don't know. That could have some uncertainties as well. But yes, I would think that in your proposals, you will want to speak to that somewhat. I will just take this opportunity also to do a little plug for a webinar we are having tomorrow on the new DRK 12 solicitation. And so these questions could probably be more fully unpacked perhaps during that webinar, thinking about new submissions. Perhaps the focus of this webinar more explicitly on sort of how do we handle our current project.
So actually there is a question about pending proposals. So it's not exactly a current awarded project, but it's in what ways is COVID-19 impacting the review of pending DRK 12 proposals?
We are continuing to make you know, decisions, funding decisions. It's just that some of us are also becoming school teachers and homeschool parents at the same time. So we've generally remained on target in terms of comparisons to prior years. We've been able to get work done and make funding decisions in a timely manner. We are just now at the 6-month deadline in terms of when proposals were received by the NSF back in the fall. So, you know, yes, and for those projects that have been awarded, yes, the program made sure that those PIs had contingency plans in place with respect to COVID. You know, for a lot of these projects, there is some perhaps development work that happens in the early phases, whether it be measures or materials. And so some of that work can go on. We have flexibility around start dates, and so projects could be pushed back. We also, you know, PIs at the onset of at the beginning of a project sometimes may have a little bit of an advantage because they can sort of delay do other things while they perhaps wait for schools to open maybe next school year.
Thank you. I see we have a hand raised.
Yeah, so we have one question. Shakhnoza, I'm going to allow you to unmute. So please select unmute now when prompted, and you can ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for doing this webinar. It's so timely. I have a DRK 12 project, and I'm on the second year of implementation, and one of the major implementation of our program is that we bring close to 100 students, emergent bilingual students, to the campus for a 2-week period to work with us on different STEM projects. And now, given what's happening, I'm in the state of Massachusetts. I have 2 different districts with who I work, and they are reluctant to do any kind of program, either in person. Well, in person is right now is almost impossible because the schools are closed, and then we don't have yet any guidelines from the governor in terms of what's going to happen in the summer. But the school districts are telling me that because kids don't have laptops, because they don't have the necessary technology, even virtual work seems to be impossible at this point. And then they would be really worried to do anything in person during the summer, which I agree with them. But at the same time, I'm not sure how do we move forward, because this was a longitudinal study, and then the summer was a major part of our intervention. I know I'm asking a big question, but any kind of guidance I would really appreciate.
Laura, does this seem like a question you would take a stab at?
I think it's ultimately, it doesn't look good to be able to bring students onto your campus right now. I don't know if it's possible to begin to think about spreading it out over a longer period of time and doing it online, so that they can still have the experience. I don't know anything about your project, so I'm not able to say whether it's even physically possible, logistically possible to do any of the intervention online. But you may still be able to get the immersive language experience for students through some of the activities. And again, it would go back to whether you're addressing the same research question. And I doubt you would be able to address the same research question, which would mean, I think, that you would go to the program officer and talk about adaptations to the research purpose. But that's it.
Anybody want to add anything? Okay.
Yeah, I guess I would just second that. If indeed the original intent is very difficult to carry out or next to impossible, then yeah, you should reach out with details to your program officer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, continue to raise your hands if you want to ask a question, or type them in the Q&A. We have great conversation going on in the chat box as well. So here's a question. How should projects navigate supplement requests? For instance, a project that is mid-data collection and we're changing the research plan, where changing the research plan would significantly impact the project.
Yeah, I guess I can jump in. It's a difficult one. With respect to everything I've already said, certainly reach out to your program officer. I'll just share a brief conversation I had with a team last week. It's a very similar question around project resources and things like this. Some of the things that we look for on our end is the extent to which the project has expended funds There are cases where there are large unspent balances. And so when those projects come in for supplement requests, generally doesn't review that favorably. The other thing I'll say is that in some cases, well, this particular team, basically all the senior PIs agreed to reduce their FTE and sort of put the project on hold for a year, continue to pay graduate students, do data analysis, do writing and some dissemination, but basically put things on hold, reduce FTE of senior personnel a little bit in an effort to sort of save costs on the project, with the assumption that these activities would essentially be pushed to the following year. You know, still quite a bit of uncertainty around if and when they would be able to do that, but they were sort of taking those precautions as a team to try to carry out the work in a reasonable way. I don't know, Beth, if you have anything to add to that with respect to supplements. I mean, you know, this is going to be something that NSF has to deal with going down the road, certainly into next fiscal year, in terms of how we make decisions around supplements. And it's going to be a case-by-case basis, clearly. And so these are some of the things that we're going to have to deal with on our end.
And the no-cost extension, typically, if the work gets bumped back, there's always the option to do a no-cost extension at the end of the grant to continue the work.
Yeah.
There's actually a question that somebody posed that builds on something that you said. You referred to some senior staff cutting their time to extend the funding for a year.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, for projects that will likely require extension years to meet our goals, how should we think about salaried personnel involvement? For example, we budgeted for a 2-year postdoc. Funds for that postdoc salary will no longer be available during the project's extension year. Is there a clever budgeting strategy you'd recommend to ensure that we can carry out our plans with our full research team?
Good question. Clever budgeting strategy. Beth, any ideas? Others?
Anybody in the chat box can also.
You know, in many cases, the sponsored research office at your local university could be helpful. Generally speaking, the NSF does provide a fair amount of flexibility with respect to budget, changes to budget within certain parameters are usually up to the PI and the institution. I've seen some questions around participant support costs, and changes to participant support costs do require NSF approval. And generally speaking, under these circumstances, we will be supportive of those kinds of requests. But, you know, moving money, say, out of travel into other parts of the project, I think those generally fall under the purview of the PI, as long as it's not within a certain amount, which I think is like 20% of the overall budget or something like that. So generally speaking, these kinds of changes to budget would be permissible from an NSF standpoint to allow the work to continue. Of course, run these questions past your program officer. Sometimes these budget changes need to be submitted in Fastlane, but reach out to your program officer.
Thank you. So we have a question, a lot of questions that relate to classroom observations now that we cannot do those anymore in the same way. What kinds of approaches are available, are people using for virtual classroom observations? And so I think people can answer this in the chat as well, but I'm wondering if any of you have a response.
I mean, I think if they make any major changes, making sure it's covered under their IRB and consent, but some might be able to be part of the Zoom meetings if they're doing synchronous, or you may be able to collect student written work depending on what the focus of the project is, would be some options. I don't know, Laura, if you've had others.
Yeah, I'm not sure of if there are any useful tools available out there. Again, it's going to vary from project to project and be quite specific about what people want to measure. But I wouldn't assume that one can just use a typical classroom observation protocol and transfer it online. If you're planning to make modifications, you know, you would have to go back into the literature to see what online, whatever interaction, engagement, teaching effectiveness, whatever these things are, that you're interested in measuring and seeing what modifications might need to be made to current instruments. I'm not sure what would exist right now. There's, of course, all sorts of log data that one could rely on. And there are certainly studies out there that track use. Sometimes it's used as being analogous to engagement, but other times it's used for different purposes. So there are lots of opportunities here, but I'm not sure that we're all ready with tools available right now to run with it. So I think they would just do it cautiously.
Building on that, there's a question related to IRB issues beyond consent that are specific to using Zoom for interviewing students in their homes. For instance, does another trusted adult need to be in Zoom interview? Ellen, you might be able to answer that.
Well, we've taken the position that, you know, there certainly needs to be an adult setting up, and there needs to be a lot of interaction with the adult, you know, the parent, the legal guardian, before those interviews happen. So ideally, there needs to be consent to the, you know, the Zoom recording or the Zoom, you know, certainly, presumably, in most cases, there's some type of recording going on. So there needs to be consent for that. There needs to be consent for the Zoom interaction or where the application happens to be. And there needs to be involvement of the parent setting it. You know, ideally it's set up in a sort of private and appropriate space in the house that, you know, it's not, you're not set up that you're capturing, you know, the kitchen and other family members and, you know, who knows in the background. So there needs to be quite a lot of interaction with the parent to set up those kind of sessions.
Great, thank you. Again, anybody is welcome to make comments by raising their hands, ask questions by raising their hands, and continue to throw your ideas into the chat box as well. So we have a question for you, Beth. You mentioned that teachers you work with have resorted to their previous practices. What kind of recommendations would you have for someone who is planning or studying student writing and discussions? I assume meaningful collaborations among students are possible in online environments like Zoom or others. So what kinds of adjustments have teachers made that you would recommend?
And some of them are using even just Google Docs and having kids take pictures of their solutions that they write. And then they're calling them to, just like you would in a math discussion, where you may have 3 solutions that you really want the kids to focus on. And then they've got prompts where the students have to compare and contrast them. So Google Docs has been one of the tools that they've used. Sometimes they've used Zoom. Those have been the primary ones. This is something, I mean, this is one of the things they asked me for advice on, and not being at the university this year, I haven't had to figure it out like all of my colleagues have. So I've been using the resources that are available online too. But those are the 2 that they've found useful, but they wish there were additional things they could use. I'm seeing people writing about Flipgrid and other things in the chat too.
Great. Anything else from anyone? There was a question that was thrown into the chat that you guys might be able to respond to as well. What are the ethical issues involved in pausing projects that have GTAs or postdocs attached? How would that decision impact funding for grad students who are relying on funding?
I mean, I would think that that would be, I think there are different aspects of the project that could be paused that wouldn't require the GTAs or postdocs to not be working on the project, depending on where the project timeline is at. I would assume there could still be transcription work and analysis or instrument design that could be happening.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, you know, we certainly want to be supportive of grad students and postdocs working on projects. I think that is a huge priority. We want to minimize the, you know, sort of negative fallout to those individuals. Certainly try to keep them on projects, keep them writing, keep them disseminating, analyzing data, that sort of thing. Yes, we want to be supportive of those activities.
Okay, great. Here's an NSF question probably. While awardees are able to request a no-cost extension in the last year of a project, is it possible to request an extension earlier if your research or your human services have been significantly impacted?
Yeah, you can. It may not be that necessary, but you know, essentially, NSF awardees are entitled to what is called a grantee-approved no-cost extension. That's the first one, which is, you know, you submit it in FastLane and it's pretty much automatic. You're entitled to that. The second one is what we call an NSF-approved no-cost extension. And that one is for a second, basically 12 months. And that one sometimes gets a little bit more scrutiny. But in these times, I think program officers are going to be very flexible in terms of approving second no-cost extensions. So yeah, that's advice on no-cost extensions. You can submit them early, but please reach out to your program officer.
Okay, I'll pause for a minute in terms of anybody who wants to either raise their hand to ask a question directly or to share some way they figured out how to move their research forward, or a question they want to ask other participants. No hands? Okay. What advice do the panelists have around deciding whether to adapt versus postpone plans for research? That might be a hard one to answer, but I don't know if anybody has wants to take a stab at that.
I will, if I think the answer to that is connected with what Rob talked about, whether it's possible to, at the other end, get an extension to keep it going. It's also relevant for that question about whether it's ethical to not be supporting postdocs or graduate assistants during that year. But I would imagine that is ultimately a question for the program officer as to whether it is feasible to answer the research questions at all. I mean, if it's not possible to conduct the research versus being able to modify it in some way where you can keep ticking over for a year. And then of course, you know that you're spending down funds that you will need later. So it's all a balance in particular situation, I would imagine.
Yeah, this chat from Chris Wilson, I'll just read it out loud. Encourage folks to look for silver linings, such as an additional year to pilot and revise research instruments, more time to further develop and refine the intervention that's being studied, that sort of thing. So yeah, there's work that could still be done around development work, which Beth has been talking about. So I would just echo that advice. And then, of course, what Laura said in terms of, scope, in scope, out of scope kinds of activities certainly should be run past the program officer.
And I actually feel like in my response to Shakhnoza earlier, that I was also sort of coming at it from a deficit point of view, whereas I should have been, well, what are the opportunities that you could take this summer to perhaps study something related to the coronavirus, for example, with these students who are English learners. So there could be new opportunities there for modifying your research.
Great, thank you. We have time for maybe one last question. So I'll put it out to the audience. Your chance to raise your hand and ask a question. Yes, Francis. I think Jen will allow you to be unmuted and you can ask your question.
Hi, so I was wondering if you have some maybe general advice for how to take equity considerations into account, particularly when working maybe directly with students in low-income areas who might not have access to some of the technology that we would need to continue the research, maybe things that teachers have done or other researchers have done that would allow them to continue working with student populations who don't have reliable internet access or the technology that they would need at home to use Zoom or things like that.
I mean, these are critically important issues. The NSF has made a number of rapid awards looking at these very questions of access and equity. I think with respect to an individual DRK-12 project, that's a difficult question just because it depends on what the focus of the project was. I think we all, feel terribly for these communities that are suffering all sorts of learning loss and setbacks due to loss of instructional time and so forth. I just, it's like, and we would love to be able to do more in terms of technology and access and so forth. I think it's just a question of what's reasonable for any given PI to be able to do with respect to these issues. And so I think that's a real challenge. And the NSF has been committed to efforts to look at these questions of equity and access and disparities across communities with a lot of the rapid awards that we've made through EHR, looking at these very questions. So anyway, yeah, it's really difficult to see and to think about the setbacks that will happen for a lot of students and a lot of communities in the US.
I was going to say, some of the teachers that I'm working with are actually sending kits home for the kids instead of relying on technology too, but that also requires funds to be able to mail things into the community to be able to support some of the learning. And it's, again, like steps back. It's not interacting with lots of other people like you would in a classroom, and all of those issues coming up too. It's huge, and I don't think districts or researchers have a lot of answers for what to do.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Quickly, Catherine, that these two questions here about reports definitely address delays. There's a whole section in the annual report about changes and problems. And I would make sure that you address COVID-related delays and changes in that part of your annual report. And so if you don't, your report's probably going to be returned to you. And then you're probably going to also want to talk about your expenditures and how COVID and this situation is having an impact on your expenditures in your annual report. So yeah, that one I wanted to get out because I know that a lot of people are working on their annual reports now.
Thank you. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left. Actually, there was one question at the beginning that might lead us into final comments. Alan, folks wanted to know how they can get updates about your work exploring options for digital gathering of consent forms, or to look for other emerging guidance on these issues. So maybe you could address that and any sort of final comments you have.
There are, oh gosh, OHRP actually had an webinar in February, actually, before this became more critical on electronic consent. I think you can find a link on their website. I think it's also on YouTube somewhere. That's worth taking a look at. You know, I spent a couple of weeks ago, I spent a lot of time at e-sign applications like Sign or Adobe Sign and some other ones. They're not ideal for getting electronic consent because, you know, particularly if you're assuming that your audience, you know, some of them only have a mobile phone, you know, reading a consent form on a mobile phone and then putting a digital signature on the end is not ideal. Yeah, I mean, still really sort of looking at this. I mean, I actually like the idea of the project that I was reviewing earlier this week, where they were basically would email a consent form and then go over it with the parent and the child, you know, at the beginning of the Zoom session or whatever application they were using at the beginning. So there was much more interactive and it didn't depend on, you know, reading the form or, you know, using a small device to try and figure out what was going on. But this is still sort of a work in process. I've seen different projects and different IRBs take different approaches to it.
Thank you. Laura, do you have, or Beth and Rob, do you have any final sort of thoughts or advice? Laura, we could start with you if you do.
Yes, I just to acknowledge that these are really challenging. They're challenging not only for us as researchers, they're challenging for the universities and organizations where we work, and for the children that we're conducting research with in the schools and the classrooms. So maybe keep expectations low and be flexible while also being thorough and rigorous in thinking about how your research is being impacted, like to think in all sorts of directions about what might I be missing here, about what's going on, what could be affected, and to be cautious and careful in proceeding.
Thank you.
I think I agree with what Laura said, and I'll echo what Bruce said in the chat about working with our partners in making these decisions instead of making these decisions separate from the people that we're working with, alongside always keeping the questions that Francis posed toward the end about how is what I'm doing allowing some people to have access and others not, and what can we do to create more access and create more equitable learning environments through the work that we do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think these are really challenging times. We are here to be supportive of you in carrying out your research, and certainly wish you all the best in doing good work. Thank you for participating today, and maybe we'll see some of you tomorrow for the solicitation webinar, where maybe we can talk about your next research idea that could be COVID related or sort of distance learning related.
Thank you. Maybe get Liana to put that URL up again in case you want to register for that. So thank you, panelists, for your thoughts, joining us today. That actually ends our webinar. So thank you to all who participated. And again, we will send a recording of this webinar to all registered participants and post it on our website in case you weren't. We'll also continue to include NSF resources on this topic in our newsletters. So goodbye, stay safe and well, and we hope that you're able to adapt your research to these times. Good luck.
Thanks, Catherine and Cadre.
Thank you.
Thank you.